Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Pam and I make videos around mental health, trauma and recovery. So as you can tell by the title of this video, we're going to be talking about Eve today. Right now, this is a bit different from the videos that I usually do where I just give advice or technique. I just wanted to bring some lived experience, humanize things a little bit more and actually show you how relevant a lot of these stories in the Bible are today, in our day and age, in our generation, right? And I also wanted to do this because I'm a Christian. I love the Bible. I love reading the Bible and I love talking about mental health, trauma, recovery, counseling. And I just thought, why not combine the two? The Bible is filled with so much chaos and so much dysfunction that I just thought, you know what, this is so relatable. Not only for me, but I'm sure it may be relatable for some of you guys watching as well. So hence why I'm doing this type of video, and hoping to continue doing this type of video alongside some of my previous ones talking about psychology and, more educational content as well. So yeah, I do hope you enjoy. Strap on your seatbelt because this story is going to be a juicy one. So yeah, we're going to be talking about Eve today. The first woman to ever live, the first woman to ever do it, the first woman to cause us pain when we're giving birth to kids, but let's not get into all of that, okay? So to summarize the story of Eve can be found in the book of Genesis. It starts around chapter 2 verses 22. I've got some notes in here, so do bear with me if you see me looking down. So Genesis chapter 2 verses 22 is where we first see Eve introduced, right? And she was essentially created from Adam's rib. So when God made everything in the world, made man, Adam, put him to sleep, took a rib out, made Eve. Now we can tell Adam was very excited when Eve came along because he started spitting, rapping and he's like, flesh of my flesh, bone on my bone, at last. Like he was so excited to have Eve. And they lived in this beautiful Garden of Eden, where they had when I think of the Garden of Eden, guys, when I close I just see flowers everywhere. I see flowers, the right temperature. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. I see them just strolling, hear the birds chirps, like a beautiful garden scenery where they had access to everything they could want, right? They had all the pleasures of life. So this is where they lived. God put them in a garden to live in there, to enjoy life. With the exception of one rule, and the rule was that you can have everything in this garden, this is all yours, but do not touch this tree, do not eat any fruit from this specific tree. As the story goes on, we see Eve being deceived by a serpent who's a devil, who shows up to her in the form of a serpent, deceives and convinces her to eat from this specific tree they're not meant to eat from. And not only did she eat the fruit, she also gives some to Adam, her husband, to eat it as well. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, I've read this story several times. I didn't, for some reason, I never realized that Adam was actually stood there when she was communing with the enemy. So I'm thinking, why didn't you stop her? Why didn't you step in for your woman? Like, why? And on top of that, you go... Anyway, let's not get into it. Yeah, let me just quickly summarize this so we can get into the analysis of this, right? So anyways, she eats the fruit, gives some to Adam, Adam eats it, and now this is where it gets, crazy, I guess, because God then begins to question them, saying, what's going on? And instead of Adam defending his wife, his story is another one in its own anyway. Instead of him defending her, he essentially throws her under the bus and said to God, the woman you get, essentially trying to say to God, it's her fault, right? So long story short, the consequences for those actions and that disobedience was that they were asked to leave the Garden of Eden. So they'll move from the lovely Garden of Eden, and other consequences such as, Adam will have to work the ground in order for them to eat, and Eve would have to experience pain during childbirth, and so on and so forth. So, they've now left the Garden of Eden. The story shows that they then go on to have 3 kids. They have Cain, who's the eldest, they have Abel, and then they have Seth. Unfortunately, Cain ends up murdering his brother Abel, which in itself is a whole hot mess. And then obviously they have Seth later on, who's the last born. And then I think the story pretty much ends there. Then just goes on to talk about Cain getting married, being exiled from their community as a result of murdering his brother. And then he goes off to then have children. And that's essentially how that whole family narrative ends. So let's get into the analysis. Me analyzing this from mental health background, counseling elements and things like that. So when I was reading this story, the first thing that I noticed was marital dysfunction. Now, the Bible doesn't specifically talk about marital dysfunction, which is why I'm hoping to do this video, because although it talks about these events happening, we don't get to see the emotions that came out from these people, from Eve, from Adam. We don't get to see the impact of some of these things on them. So I'm hoping to analyze it and break it down, like I said, from my counseling background, from my mental health background, just to help you see how relatable this narrative really is. So like the first thing that, you know, let's say if Eve was my client, right? She came to me and we're picking up, she told me this narrative. This is what happened. My man did this. My son murdered my son. These are some of the themes and some of the things that I'll hope to explore with her in sessions, right? So the first thing I'm going to be looking at is whether or not there was conflict in the marriage. I think there would have been, because firstly, I'm sure she would have hoped that Adam would have protected her, or at least taken accountability for the role that he played in eating the fruit, right? Because that decision cost them their home. So first of all, we see high levels of stresses there. They've lost their home. The home that was so beautiful, where they had access to. They've lost the pleasures of their home. They lost everything as a result of that decision. Not only have you lost your home, your man didn't defend you. In fact, he pushed you. He said you are the reason why we ate the fruit, right? I'm sure this response that Adam gave to God when they were being questioned would have caused Eve to probably feel quite betrayed. I would imagine that would have brought up a lot of feelings of contempt towards him, perhaps sadness, perhaps disappointment, so many different feelings, because she would have probably hoped that he would. That's what husbands are meant to do, right? When we get married and we take the vows, you take the vow to protect and to love and to cherish and to support. And some husbands like, I'll take a bullet for my wife, but when the bullet came, Adam said, nope, he ain't gonna be me. So he's just volunteering his wife, saying, it's your problem, you're the one who. So there would have been a lot of feelings, and I'm sure this would have caused a lot of conflict in their relationship. So firstly, I would have explored that with her. Like, I would want to know, did it cause conflict between you and Adam? And was it sort of conflict, a contained one around that time? Or was it something that carried on throughout the rest of their marriage? And I think it probably carried on, because, so many different things happened after that. So yeah, that's one of the things I want to explore with Eve. How did she feel about that? Not only that, like I said, the stresses of losing their home, Adam now having to work the ground, her experiencing, pain during pregnancy and things like that. How did it affect their marriage? Did it cause any friction, in terms of how Adam handled the situation at the time? I'll then want to explore with her grief, because Eve's story is filled with so much grief. Well, we see the loss of a home. That's a form of grief, right? I think sometimes when we think of grief and loss, we only think about it in terms of death, but actually there's so many different forms of losses. We see her losing her home. That is a form of loss, right? Some aspects of her relationship potentially with her husband, maybe she had to grieve the Adam that she wanted, or she had hoped he would have been for her before he threw her under the bus. You had this perfect man who's showering you with poetry, for him to switch up on you like that. It's possible that she would have had to grieve the version of Adam that she perhaps expected and didn't get. That's the possibility. But not only that, we see traumatic grief in the sense that her son Cain ends up murdering Abel. That in itself is such a traumatic, like, I'm a mum of 2 boys myself, right? And if that happened, I don't know how I'd cope. Not only that, you get ambiguous grief in a sense that the one who committed the crime is now being exiled from the community. As a mum, I don't think her love for Cain will just disappear like that. Yes, he's brought so much pain to you, so much grief by ending your son's life, but your love for your children don't go away. Not only that, you've also lost him, right? Ambiguous grief in a sense that although he's still alive, you don't have that physical access to him anymore. Not only that, but your feelings towards him is now very conflicting and very complicated. Excuse me. So these are some of the themes that I'll be exploring with grief. Like I said, traumatic grief, complex grief, ambiguous grief, the loss of her home, the grief of perhaps grieving the Adam that she would have thought or she would have hoped for. So these are some of the themes that will be explored. Did she experience sadness? I'm sure she did. Did she experience anger? I'm sure she did. Did she experience guilt? I'm sure she did. But not only that, I would want to know if she blamed herself for the sequence of things that happened after they were moved from the Garden of Eden. And the reason why I say this is because even in our own lives, right, sometimes we have a habit of connecting things that are not really connected. So what I mean by that is that if we've made a decision in our life, quite a significant one, that has caused us so much pain or has severe consequences, sometimes there's a tendency to assume that every negative thing that happens in our life is because we made that one bad decision. I think that's quite a human experience, and I think that's quite common. I've come across a couple of people, and even sometimes in my own life, I'm thinking, oh, is this happening because I did this one bad thing, or am I being punished? I deserve this punishment, right? I'm wondering if Eve carried that shame, or she carried this idea that even the loss of her children was because of that initial decision to eat from that tree. These are all some of the things that I want to explore. I want to explore guilt and shame, right? I think sometimes we use those two words and those feelings interchangeably, but there's a very clear difference between the two. And what the difference is that shame is often very intrinsic, right? Is based on internal feelings of self. Is that fundamental idea and belief that you as a person, you are flawed, right? Is internal. Whereby guilt is more associated with the external, is based on what you do and the feeling from that, right? Can guilt turn into shame? Possibly. I would want to know that with Eve, did it start with guilt from that? And then as time went on, because things kept going wrong, things like the death of her son, the pain that she had to experience, Adam now having to work, did she now begin to actually internally look at herself to say, I am flawed fundamentally, because this has happened, this is all my fault, right? Did that guilt ever go away, or did it stay with her throughout the rest of the life? Did Adam she would have been reminded of that decision anyway when giving birth, because she now experiences pain, right? When she gave birth to pain, she would have been reminded of that decision. When she gave birth to Abel, she would have reminded of that decision when she gave birth to Seth. So those constant reminders about the decision that she made, and I don't doubt that would have caused her to feel some type of way about herself and would have burdened her quite a lot, right? So we see all these different things. Like I said, I would also want to explore what motherhood was like for her, in a sense that, like I said, there would be a lot of complex feelings around her relationship with Cain anyway, because of what he had done. But also in having Seth, I would want to know, did she experience any anxiety around Seth's pregnancy? But also even after Seth was born, did she end up becoming an anxious parent? Did she end up developing an anxious attachment to Seth due to fear that he may pass or something negative would happen, because she's had all these negative things happening in her life since that decision was made? So there is so many different things to explore. Like I said, there's marital issues I see when I read this story. There is family dysfunction I see when I read this story. There is different types of loss and grief within this story. There is motherhood, parenting. There is so much to her story, and I think it's so relatable. You may not find her whole story relatable. Maybe, you haven't had a sibling kill a sibling or things like that, but maybe you've experienced sibling loss in your family, right? What does that look like? Parental anxiety, separation anxiety, family dysfunction, marital issues, losing your family home, losing maybe the lifestyle that you had before, and the complexities and feelings that there are so many different things I would want to explore with Eve. And like I said, her story, initially, before I sat down to analyze her story, I never really looked at it like that. When I hear Eve, I'm like, yes, I know who she is and I know what she did. But in exploring her story, I was like, I just see a girl, a woman who made a mistake, who made a choice, a very poor choice, who essentially had to live with that decision for the rest of her life, who had to, try and manage as best as she could, you know, with all the chaos and things that came following that decision. So yeah, I just wanted to share this perspective with you, like I said, and hope that you find it relatable, and that you see that actually these stories that we read in the Bible, it's not very far from our generation and the things that we've gone through, or the things that a lot of us are experiencing. There is nothing new under the sun. The Bible says that. So if these women can live through that, and these people can live through and be okay, and things like that, then we will be too, right? We will be too. And it's just knowing that we will be okay. And I think what I love about these stories, as I'm reading them and analyzing them and things like that, all I'm seeing is God's grace through everything, right? For example, you know, even when they were told to leave Eden, God could have just left them, but he clothed them, right? He didn't have to say that you can still have food. Yes, you have to suffer the consequences of your action. You have to work the ground to have food, but you still have food, right? Yes, you have to go through pain when you're having children, but you can still experience motherhood and the beauty in parenting, right? Even things like Cain ending his brother's life, right? God didn't have to show grace, but when Cain was like, God, this punishment is too severe. What if somebody tries to harm me? God said, if somebody does that, they're gonna experience consequences times 7. They're gonna also be punished even more than you. Like, God's grace just radiates through these narratives. So yeah, guys, I think I'm gonna end it there today. I'm probably gonna try and, like I said, do more of these videos and mix it in with some of techniques and other things that I've learned in my mental health background. But I do hope that you enjoyed it. Press the like button, subscribe, put any comments down of any specific stories that you want me to cover, and thank you so much for watching. And I'll see you in my next video. Take care. Bye.